can I just start by having you introduce yourself and give me your pronouns?
Sure. My name is Doug Bierend. I'm a freelance writer, recently a first-time author. My pronouns are he, him.
Where are you located right now?
I'm in Dover Plains, New York. It's about 2 hours north of New York City,
Great. What's
right on the
the
Connecticut
mushroom
border.
scene like over there?
Well, the mushrooms themselves are pretty, they're all over. It's a real hot spot for them. But as far as like the community, this area is not as like active, at least not as far as I've found. There are definitely people around here. My roommate, for one, and in the Catskills, that area in particular, and kind of further north in the Hudson Valley, it's like some of the best just mushroom hunting you'll find, and also lots of communities of dedicated mushroom hunters. So.
Has that sort of been your in to the community? Like, have you been involved at all in the local mushroom sphere?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I kind of found my way into it, it was in Rochester, and it was through Smugtown Mushrooms and Olga
Smugtown.
Tsogas, who, yeah, it's like the first. It's the beginning of my book because that's the beginning of my kind of journey, and it represents, I think, a certain facet of like myco culture, which is sort of what I was trying to share with people. It's a subculture of a subculture, and it's a lot of kind of people focused on mutual aid, a lot of like kind of anarchist sort of conversations, and like food and medicine sovereignty and justice and stuff like that. And I mean, for me, it's part of what drew me in, because it wasn't just like mushrooms, which are cool and amazing all on their own, but it was all these values associated with them too. And but there's also like the traditional sort of mycological societies, maybe a little older population, or a little more focused on foraging or culinary dimensions of mushrooms and stuff. So there's a spectrum. I tend more toward the kind of, I don't know, punk side of it, I guess.
Your introduction to mushrooms as kind of an in to those subcultures is something that I think, for me at least, like really was able to vocalize my own interest in it. A connection that I hadn't made before. Before we get too much into the book, I want to just gush over some of your work. You've been an independent writer and a freelance journalist for a few years now, covering topics like mushrooms, sustainable agriculture, accessible foods. Notably, you did an article called The New York Artist Reintroducing Wild Edible Foods, which focused on the collaborative Urban Resilience Banquet's mission to introduce urban dwellers to foraging methods in a cityscape. You interviewed Leah Penniman, author of Farming While Black, about the food apartheid and Soulfire Farms' efforts to train a new generation of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous farmers to connect with and revive a largely forgotten cultural legacy of food sovereignty. You also talked with Olga Tsogas from Smugtown Mushrooms about the difficulties of growing an anti-capitalist grassroots community founded on principles of personal, societal, and ecological resilience. But you've also covered a range of topics like trans hack feminists pushing boundaries to reclaim gynecological science, inherent pro-police propaganda and Grand Theft Auto 5, the potential for solidarity in online communities. You've done so much really incredible stuff, and I'm wondering if you feel like there's any common threads that sort of weave together all of these ideas.
First of all, thanks for saying all that and for reading those things. And it's an unusual experience for me to have my work recounted to me. So it feels kind of good. I appreciate that.
Of
And
course.
yeah, it's an interesting question, certainly for me, because it's my work and it's what I'm trying to do. I might give you different answers at different times of day, but right now I think what I'm feeling from my past work and where I'm trying to go is a sense of the need for deep reassessment of many different layers of social assumptions and the systems we rely upon. And I'm kind of looking for examples of work or conversations that people are having, whether it's through a character or a story or project or small business or something that, yeah, speaks to another way of doing things or another way of looking at access to food, access to healthcare, where power comes from in terms of like creating a market versus creating a community. I feel like a spidey sense go off sometimes if I encounter something that speaks to the values I'm trying to uphold. I've come to sort of see what I'm doing as a kind of like ethical PR in a way, because I'm not, I mean, hopefully ethical. And I'm following this thread in my mind. I think it roots back to my original interest in like technology and media. And I had this, I was just about 10 years ago when I was starting to write, I think I was a lot more optimistic about the potential for like technology to save us, you know, and for us to kind of invent our way out of the problems we've invented our way into. And the process of doing those stories and looking for examples of that brought me inevitably to realize that a lot of it's just marketing. That you know, it's probably not you know, there's probably not an IPO that's going to mark the you know, transition to a better world. And I think it got, and through some life experiences, I had a chance to start writing about food and um, actually just before this conversation, I was having a conversation with editors at The Counter, which is the first place I wrote about food. And the first story I wrote for them was the one about Ogosogus. And so
And
in
that was back in
food,
like 2016. So you've been
yeah,
doing this for a few years now.
about 5 years now, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, like the halfway point in my career at this point in time, I started making that turn, and I just realized that the questions, the answers, and the questions themselves were a lot more compelling in conversations about land and food, and it just connects to everything. And there's also a lot of, you know, I'm interested in new technologies, and I'm interested in systems and yeah, paradigm shifting developments in general, and so I've just come to recognize that more in small things, or so-called small things, you know, like in someone setting up a sea container and trying to start a community garden in Philly or something, or in a, yeah, mushrooms for some reason became like a real nexus for me of like the kind of technological systems, networked thinking, you know, that scratched that itch, but also brought ecological perspective, sustainability, and reciprocity with nature, and the more kind of hippie side of things as I've you
Right.
know,
Right.
gotten older.
I think that's what's so incredible about fungi. I'm going to just go ahead and say it. I tend to say fungi. I'm going to try to say fungi throughout this interview, but feel free to correct me.
No, no,
So,
they're both valid. Just so you
both
know,
correct.
you can
Okay.
say it. In,
Good to
yeah,
know. Good to know. Yeah, you say that you're not an investigative journalist. I think what makes your journalistic perspective so valuable is that you really take the time to not only understand communities, but you let yourself be a part of those communities as well. And so it feels like what you're telling us and what you're reporting, it's not just coming from some like, you know, effervescent journalistic perspective. It's coming from you. And I
yeah,
think that's what makes it so easy to connect with. I mean, going off of your kind of point about being hopeful that we're going to just sort of invent ourselves out of a lot of the problems that we've dug ourselves into. I think that's what's so fascinating about mushrooms and fungi is that it seems to sort of be this really mysterious you know, sphere of ecology that sort of seems to have a little bit of everything. Working on this book, you spent so much time all over the country with some of the world's most fascinating mycologists and mushrooms. How has all of your time spent with fungi shifted your perspective of the world or your own life?
like you say, they really do sort of touch on everything. They feel like a really particularly alluring just entry point into consciousness about nature, about the connectedness, interconnectedness, interdependency, and
A lot of big
co-constructed.
words in the mushroom
Yeah, this is
world.
hard. I should have warmed up. What's the word I'm trying to find here? Co-constructed nature of things. Like we don't make sense without other people. You know, as individuals, we're in a vacuum. We're meaningless, right? We only make sense in context of everything else that's part of life. And fungi really sort of embody that in nature, and they also represent this massive kingdom of life, or queendom of life, or kingdom, or queerdom, as people are saying.
I love
That
that.
yeah, it seems to attract subversive thought, and maybe and it inspires it too through if only through psilocybin and you know, those sorts of experiences, but also through perspective shifts, like I'm kind of getting at here. And I mean, it's akin to like being introduced to plants for the first time, you know, like it's something on that scale. Like you walk into the woods and, oh, you know, I just noticed these things, these trees and these shrubs and these herbs and things. Like, I wonder what we can do with them. I wonder what opportunities they represent, what we can learn from them about, you know, oh, it turns out they make the air we breathe, you know, or at least a large percentage of it. So it's just a profound subject, and it's rich and ripe for exploration by almost anybody and for contribution by almost anybody. As for my own experience, I mean, it started well, it started originally with Paul Stamets and the TED Talk, from like
The
2009, I
TED
think it
Talk,
was.
the
The
infamous
TED
TED
Talk, yeah.
Talk. Yeah.
Everybody knows in this space what I'm talking about.
I want to present to you a suite of 6 mycological solutions using fungi, and these solutions are based on mycelium.
My view on it has changed since then, and I think that's like a certain track of the conversation, and I'm interested in another one that aren't necessarily, they may cross at certain points or run in parallel, but that's a sort of solutionist approach, I think, that is like mushrooms will save the world, kind of the way technology will. But it was going into the woods for the first time with someone who knew how to look for mushrooms that sort of changed my life and set me on this trajectory. And also just being introduced to this thing that's been happening, and in terms of cultivation, in terms of mycology as a science. This has kind of been going on underground, as it were, for a long time, and is now meeting a moment of receptivity. Like the world is ready, I think, for those conversations, as people are starting to recognize that things are falling apart and we need to do things differently. Mushrooms are like there to not only say like, well, hey, here's a way we might grow food or medicine, or sustain local economies, or degrade contaminants in the soil, or change our minds or expand our minds, or whatever. There's all these ways that one might bounce off of the terror of our moment or the troubles of our time into hope, by looking to mushrooms. And so it's hard to sum up what they've meant to me, but it's some version of bringing me to recognition of nature and our interdependence, and at the same time giving me some hope about the potential that, like, hey, here's a set of organisms that have made it for millions and millions of years, that far precede us, and they've done it by being partners with their ecologies, or within their ecologies, more than trying to like dominate them. And the fact that we're starting to listen to them more and more makes me hopeful that maybe we'll get the message we need to from them. So
fungi is a great example of an entire kingdom of life that really represents the importance of living in symbiosis with your environment. Symbiosis as a term was coined to describe lichens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's my understanding. Yeah.
So at the top of the interview, you talked a little bit about mycology as being a fringe punk subculture of natural science, and I want to dive into that a little bit. So could you kind of talk about your understanding of the social and cultural value that fungi presents?
We have a relationship to fungi that's not just biological, but cultural. It goes back a long ways, probably way further back than we'll ever know. The field of ethnomycology is all about trying to kind of give an account of that relationship, but there's huge holes. Some of that by way of the erasure of those practices and those cultures, by largely colonial forces throughout history. The easiest example to point to is South and Central America, and the practices around sacred mushroom consumption that are still extant, certainly especially in like parts of Mexico. But you'll find records of like the Spanish colonists like trying to stamp it out or get it under control, and being just horrified by what they were seeing. So I can't really speak to what mushrooms really mean to another culture, but
sure,
I feel like that trend that I just alluded to may have something to do with the kind of mycophobia that we tend to describe or see here.
Yeah, that leads right into sort of what I was also wanting to talk about, which is this idea of like mycophilic versus mycophobic cultures. And like we have this pervasive disgust and fear of mushrooms that exists. I remember growing up, like I was terrified to even touch them. I thought if I touched a mushroom, like that would just be instant death. We like to categorize things into these like nice little boxes that are easy to define. And fungi aren't that. Mushrooms are a bit disruptive to like ideas of the binary. They're subversive to patriarchal and colonial systems. Can you maybe delve a little bit into why you think that is?
I feel like it almost gets kind of caricatured sometimes to say that like fungi are feminist or fungi are, intersectional. And like, I think that those statements are true, but it's because people are meeting them that way, and are finding that meaning in them. And yeah, I mean, the phobia that people have toward them, certainly in this country, is not based in their actual risk to our health. It's based in some sense of what they represent. And I think part of what they represent is subversion. They represent the decaying of old systems, or old structures, I should say, and replacing them with, the makings for new life. And so they're kind of, I almost for the first time in my life connected that to the phrase anti-conservative, because like they aren't about conservation as much as facilitating the forward march of life, and
new growth, right?
Yeah, new growth. And so I feel like there's some obvious maybe social political implications just in that sort of observation, but more than anything, I think it gets back to the point from before, which is just that like people are recognizing that they're talking more openly about longstanding inequities and injustices, and are forming as communities, and fungi are offering this opportunity to form again on like in all these different ways. Like in the book, there's the POC fungi community gathering, and they took up medicine as kind of the theme. And from their point of view, and in that conversation, it was looking at how, hey, there's all this conversation about psychedelic mushrooms becoming legalized and therapeutic and sort of formalized as a part of our health system, which means that the same people that are left out of the existing health system will probably be left out of that as well, or at least in some regard. And in this specific case, it's practices that actually have cultural like meaning to them, and that they maybe feel an ancestral tie to. So it's just ripe for challenging the system that has led to the exclusion and maintains the exclusion of marginalized communities. And that's just one example. I think in terms of like gender binaries, I in the book there's Dr. Patty Kaishian, who's a mycologist and taxonomist, and she in the book she identifies herself as non-binary and is taking that as her sort of lens and source of sort of affinity for these organisms that there's certain species that have like 23,000 mating types, which is sort of their equivalent of like sex. The whole framework of like male, female, or any other kind of binary is really just useless in that context. And for people who already are irked by that dichotomy, it's just a naturally resonant, set of organisms to start studying, because they're a little weird. They're, they're maligned and maybe sort of marginalized themselves, at least by mainstream society. But they're also incredibly important. They inspire thoughts of like personhood beyond human beings, that I think is, again, just creates the makings for these conversations.
What does it actually mean to be a person in this body? It's hard to use terms that we use in other areas of science to define fungi. And I think one of the biggest kind of disruptors in the way that I think about my own identity is when you start to realize how many microorganisms, from fungi to bacteria, exist in your system that you need to live. You're not just you in here. Like, you are a complex system of millions, if not billions, of other organisms that are all also independent creatures,
That's the other thing.
Right.
Like, I don't know, the word independent to me feels like it doesn't have any place in nature.
For me, my kind of big fascination with fungi came around the same time. About a year ago, a little over a year ago, I became super involved in a local community garden and composting kind of by myself for the first time, and really kind of started to get a hands-on understanding of how important these unmakers of life are. That was an idea that helped me kind of cope with my own mortality. It helped me like look directly at it. Death is an important part of life. It feeds into life. It's the only reason that things can keep going. Because of fungi, we have soil, and because of fungi, we have, there's room for plants to grow. Plants were kind of first able to even evolve the ability to photosynthesize because they were pairing with fungi, right? Like there are certain plant species that don't have any chlorophyll and can't photosynthesize, and kind of have these symbiotic relationships with fungi that allow them to kind of take energy from elsewhere, and it's a give and take.
I'll just note those monotropoid plants.
Yeah.
I believe they are more on the parasitic end of the symbiosis spectrum, and that they don't give anything back to the fungi.
They're stealing
they're just
from our
sort of
friends.
They're takers, yeah. But yeah, it's everything you're touching on there. It's just bringing to mind this theme that comes up for me a lot, which is that fungi are connected to everything and they facilitate so much, but they're not at the center of anything that we're talking about, right? They're just sort of part of the process. They're a key part of the process, but they aren't the central focus of what if we're talking about what fungi do that's interesting, we're talking about what they're doing in relationship to something else. It's not walking over the ground, it's of the ground, and it's aerating the soil, and it's creating the conditions for the survival of everything else around it. It's
right. There was a quote that I wrote down. I attended your reading at I'm sorry, I forget the name of the library.
Julia L. Butterfield Memorial Library, I believe.
Yes. You did a reading there a week or two ago. And there was a line that I wrote down because I just thought it was really beautiful. You said, isolate a fungi and you have connective potential, not a connection. And that was a really really nice way to sum that all up. They are potential, but when we talk about them, it's in context. It's always in context.
Has to be.
Yeah. And I think it's a lot easier to see the need for that context when you're talking about fungi, but the truth is that context exists whenever you're talking about really kind of any sort of biological system, right?
Yeah. There's a John Muir quote that I can't recite, and I think John Muir's been sort of deemed problematic lately, but you pick a thread in nature to tug on and it'll lead you to everything else, and that's true. I could be talking about anything on my desk right now and end up talking about forest ecologies and soil health, and it's all connected. But again, fungi are just just resonant with that way of looking at things.
Mycology is a little bit of an anomaly in the sciences, in that it's largely been built on the contributions of communities of amateurs and enthusiasts. And I just want to clear the air real quick. You also mentioned in that reading that the word amateur sort of comes from the idea of to do something out of love. And I think that's a great thing to lay out right off the bat. What is it about fungi, first of all, that attracts so many of these people, you think?
I think it's down to how many ways there are to engage and to contribute to the knowledge of them, and to build a relationship with them. Someone who's of a certain proclivity might find a lot of enjoyment just cultivating them at home. Others might find a lot of enjoyment in learning about their deepest genetic structures, or like learning how to breed them and working with them at a very precise level. Others may just like to get to know them in the woods. All of this is useful and makes a contribution because fungi are so understudied. So, yeah,
and the same way that you get sort of satisfaction out of having plants or growing plants, there is such an immense, profound satisfaction when you're able to grow your own mushrooms. I've done it only one time. I had a big bag of mold that I bought at a farmer's market in Savannah, Georgia, and I had it in the little corner of my kitchen, sliced a little X in there, and I would mist it like twice a day, but it just bloomed these gorgeous oyster mushrooms. And once that happened, I was in. I was so fully in.
I appreciate you using the term mold. It's like a destigmatizing thing there. We gotta it's mold, it's fine, it's fungi.
Probably
don't want it on your bread
in my kitchen.
It's sort of I've used the phrase that it's like a house plant you can eat without feeling guilty. Sharing space with something that most people are not very familiar with, and it's a bonding experience of sorts. You start to kind of
it's a special feeling.
The first time I grew mushrooms, I tried to really do it kind of from scratch. I was in Brooklyn at the time, and I went to the only place I could get straw was from a horse training facility in Jamaica, Queens. So I went there and I got 2 bales of hay. I didn't even need half of one. I was an idiot. I had 2 big bales in my car, and did the lime soak, and I inoculated them with Smugtown spawn, and the mushrooms were running. They weren't thriving, but they were doing okay. the day they first sprouted was the day that I signed the deal for the book. So I felt like
incredible.
Just like real kismet there. I took it as a sign, you know.
That was the mushrooms gifting you.
They know, yeah, they always
returning
know.
the gift of life.
Yeah, and then I ate them. Yeah,
and they nourished you. They live on in memory. They live on.
Yeah.
So how do you think like the creativity and imagination of amateur and enthusiasts contributes to the actual science?
And I mean, worth saying, first of all, that the whole field was basically built on amateur contributions, and largely in the UK, which is where, you know, the sort of legacy institutions of modern natural science were sort of cultivated. It's the naturalist societies that's sort of safekeep, they might say, gatekeep, I might say, you know, access to like all of the natural treasures of the world. Yeah, so they became institutions, and now they are. You got something like Kew Gardens, which is a massive institution with a lot of history, but it still needs to work with local amateurs, enthusiast groups. So to me, a really attractive part of this whole scene is that it seems to challenge who gets to do science or to contribute. You know, institutions of science are suffering from a lack of funding, which is not a good thing. But I think it is driving them to, you know, engage more with people who are building bases of knowledge that are, you know, profound and often just as, you know, refined and vast as anything you'd find in an institution. It's Christian Schwartz is a naturalist who is also in the book, and he tries to engage people to use like apps and sort of citizen science tools to contribute, even if they aren't mycologists, just as people who are like walking around and see an interesting mushroom and take a picture and upload it. Like, you know, his phrase is, you set the I don't want to mess up this phrase. It's, you set the gates wide and the door narrow. So like you let in all the information you can, and then you parse what's useful. You know,
right. You sift it out. You sift out the gold later, but let it all in.
Yeah, and so like maybe there's a role for like expertise or like credential and you know the role of like capital S science to like do that sifting at the base of that funnel. But there's also plenty of reason to engage as many people as possible in going out and engaging with fungi, which has all these other knock-on like effects, and you know, is generating culture and doing all sorts of other stuff than just building scientific databases. But it can do that too.
Yeah, there's something so beautiful about just all these punk amateur mycologists just taking it into their own hands and just deciding, you know what, we're just going to do the science. Actually, I love that people are so inspired and just connecting with nature on such a level that they are just eager to get engaged with their environment and with their communities. And the bar for entry is low. Like all it takes is to, you know, decide to take a walk and to just pay a little bit more attention, to just like take notice and look down. And I think once you start doing that, it's really difficult not to want to get involved and learn more.
Yeah. And you learn that like, oh, I can stick my nose into this rotting log and actually find joy there, you know, or something of interest. And it completely changes the terms of what's possible.
Right. There's an entire process taking place right here under our noses, you know?
Yeah, and sometimes literally right up to our nose, because we start to develop an affinity for smelling.
We're breathing it in probably with every inhale.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the thing. Whether we want to or not, it's in our noses and in our respiratory system. Yeah, and it makes it like if you discover a piece of moldy bread in your kitchen or something, it's like you're probably going to throw it out, but you're also going to be like, I wonder what that's all about.
Right. It becomes slightly less disgusting and slightly more intriguing.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned the Kew Botanical Gardens, and I'm dying to know. So it's the largest fungarium in the world?
Just vast hallways of green boxes, like 12 high, you know, and they're on like movable kind of like library tracks, you know, much bigger than what you might see at a library though. And yeah, just kind of a musky, like kind of probably what you're imagining, you know, like, instead of like,
I can smell it right now, honestly, just thinking about it.
I mean, instead of like all wood, you know, surfaces, like, you know, you might think it's a lot of concrete, you know, it's kind of a brutalist structure that they're in there, but it's sort of underground, and you go in down a staircase through this big double door, and you're in this, it's pretty vast and tall, and they've just got all sorts of like interesting mushroom like specimens lying around. They got stuff that's like signed by Charles Darwin, and I mean, they've it's just impressive in that regard.
Do they
I
let
mean,
you take a peek?
just an aesthetic regard. Yeah, I mean, they pull a box out and be like, oh, what's this? Here, they'll show you this. They've got a lot of what they call type specimens there, which are like for all of the other institutions of science around the world. Like if they want to study it, this is the one that's like at the basis of its identification, and they go like, here's
Wow.
the case example. And they've got a bunch of those there.
How do they preserve them?
Dry them. You just dry them.
Oh,
That's it.
interesting.
Apparently they're almost invulnerable to decay. Their hyphae, the mycelium, is made of with chitin, which is like the stuff in your nails or in like insect carapace. So it's a really resilient material, and they say that you can just like reinflate them with a certain solution, and they basically like keep all of their features even after years and years and years dried out. Yeah, it's really crazy.
To your knowledge, is there any sort of like a cannibalistic fungi that eats other fungi?
Oh yeah, all sorts.
Really?
I saw one the other day. I wouldn't have identified it. I was actually out with Patty Kaishi, and she's teaching at Bard, pointing out all the stuff I had no idea even existed. She's an expert. And one of the things was a scleroderma being parasitized by a bolete, like a puffball mushroom, with a bolete growing out of the side of it.
Wow.
Lobster mushrooms. I don't know if you've ever heard of lobster mushrooms.
I haven't.
I think it's like a lactarius mushroom gets colonized by this other mushroom, and it turns it like red and gives it a kind of shell. And prior to that, they're not very tasty. I don't know if they're even edible, but after the parasitization, they're like a gourmet delicacy.
Wow.
Shrimp of the woods is another one that's a parasitized mushroom. So,
there's shrimp of the woods, there's chicken of the woods.
Yeah, all of the food groups are out there in mushroom form. It's funny.
Got a whole food pyramid going on.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, it's I think it's like kind of easy to say like, oh, they're all symbiotic and holding hands and working together.
No, there's still some bad ones. There's still
Yeah.
some mean ones out there.
Oh yeah.
I'd be remiss not to talk a little bit about psychedelic psilocybin containing mushrooms or entheogens. So you dive into this a little bit in the chapter of your book, This Land is Myco Land. I'm wondering if you have any personal experiences with psychedelic mushrooms that you'd be open to sharing.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And I probably should have mentioned it when you asked about my own relationship to mushrooms, because that's really where it started, at a deeper level. I think the first time I ever did them was in like 2007, something like that. I was in my early 20s, similar to the experience of walking into the woods and kind of learning to notice for the first time. It was a real, for me, my first experience was very warm and positive and just sort of affirming. Subsequent experiences were more challenging or complicated. There's a cliche, you get the message, you hang up the phone. I kind of felt like I reached that point with it. But I think it set the grounds for a lot of the shifts in perspective that we were talking about earlier, for being receptive to this stuff. And yeah, kind of recognizing layers of reality and connection that are often just hidden to us, in day-to-day life. Maybe it wouldn't be so if our lives were ordered differently, or if our culture was different. I don't think that you necessarily need to go to mushrooms to get to that kind of insight. But given where we're at, it represents a first blush with another way of thinking and seeing,
right,
for a lot of us. So yeah, at the time I was pretty caught up in and this I'm more embarrassed to admit than anything regarding taking illicit substances. I was involved, pretty into the whole new atheist thing at the time. I feel like this is the first time I've said this in a public, anything approaching a public setting, but I could tell you more about my history that's probably surprising. I was on track to join the military at one point. Then mushrooms entered my life, and I think it allowed me the opportunity to connect with the numinous and be open to notions of the sacred and the unknowable. through direct experience, which I had put a real premium on at that time, partly because of all of the like objectivist, materialist kind of thinking I was soaking in. So yeah, for me, it was a pretty profound phase shift that it represented, and
Right.
yeah, I think it set the grounds for all of the outlook I have today.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, my first experience was something very similar, where I think I didn't take quite enough. I didn't feel a huge, like a very profound shift while it was happening, but I found in the like weeks following, I felt more clear-headed, more calm. I felt less anxiety than I remember feeling at any point in my entire life. And I became so much more inspired to start taking notice. And I think that that was a really important shift in my own mental health journey. I started journaling way more. I just started wanting to pay more attention to the things that were happening around me. I began to kind of view it more almost from an anthropological perspective, where I was like, I want to take this and I want to just observe what happens.
Yeah.
Like I want to like let it happen and see what it has to tell me. And I think a lot of people share that perspective when they take psilocybin. Not everybody, but I think a lot of people kind of have that new connection and understanding to the natural world and to mushrooms, or maybe it's like a refreshed understanding.
These are experiences and perspectives that we don't really have good words for. There are a lot of traditions and practices around psychedelic experience and medicine as the basis of cultural practice. And, I can't really speak to that at all, but these are not conversations most of us are privy to, not a vernacular most of us can speak. And even outside of those traditions, just trying to relate like what you get out of these experiences is famously futile. Like you can't really put to words what a mushroom experience is like. So I feel like that's definitely a play in it. I mean, just today I was listening to some just happenstantially like a YouTube pundit or something. It's like, I don't think I'll ever do psychedelics. He's like, I like to adjust my mood up or down. That's fine. But like, if I don't want to see like Scooby-Doo and he's not really there. And it's just like, yeah, that's not what it's about. That's not what
I
it's
mean,
really about.
by the way, if I could take mushrooms and see Scooby-Doo, I'd be taking them every fucking day.
It sounds really fun, first of all.
Yeah, it sounds great.
I've just never understood how it could be a recreational thing, or a party drug. I know people take it for fun, but kind of like what you were saying, like there's a message you think you might get from it, and I haven't done that many drugs in my life, but it is the only one that I feel that with, where it's like, I'm actually coming to this to learn something or to get an insight. And I worry about that with like the microdosing thing, which I've had good experiences microdosing, and I think it's probably good, but I feel like it's getting kind of plugged into this utilitarian sort of pharmaceuticalized kind of, yeah. To me, mushrooms are like way more about like, let's think about things in a new way and learn some stuff, and maybe it won't be comfortable, but that could be good.
Right. And I mean, entheogens are showing some really promising potential for treating like all kinds of depression in a clinical setting. My very simplified understanding of how that works is that psilocybin sort of has a way of transforming the part of the mind that's responsible for kind of generating identity and ego and like I amness, and allows you to sort of make a new connection and move forward in peace from traumas if you're open to it. But as you kind of mentioned in the chapter that I was referring to earlier, in indigenous use of entheogens, there was always a matrix. It was embedded in a cultural system of some kind. And we don't have that. Like, we have laboratory settings, we have bedrooms, and we have streets. Do you see that sort of being an obstacle in moving forward with the science of using sort of psilocybin containing mushrooms to treat mental disorders?
Yeah, I mean, this is an area where I feel like I'm probably on a little bit of thin ice, certainly compared to other people who could really speak to this in a much more informed and cogent way. But in general, yeah, I mean, I see things like you just described, the kind of standard vocabulary of like the bed and the music and the blindfold and someone holding your hand. There's a practical sort of best practices sort of approach that's being codified, standardized now in a therapeutic context. And I think that's probably good for therapeutic purposes, but it's also being patented, and it's also becoming a space for intellectual property, and there's a lot of enclosure happening.
It's being
And
colonized.
you could say it's being colonized. Yeah. And I think that if you're really listening to the message that we're talking about and that so many people can relate to, and that other people who maybe haven't had these experiences will sound like, neo hippie gibberish or something, but to me, it's sort of contrary to the spirit of the experience and the insight that one gains from developing a relationship with sacred mushrooms.
Right, and that's sort of what colonization is, right? It's sort of adopting something, taking it, and then just completely neglecting to acknowledge the entire history of that thing and where it comes from and the people that you're taking it from, right? Like, that definitely plays a huge role in it.
I mean, we think of colonizing, and there's a fungal context for the term too. When we talk about it, colonizing its substrate, and it's also extractive, and ultimately it's an extractive act. And I think that's what you see in this example. Like there are practices in parts of the world that have suffered for the popularization of these substances. The communities from which these practices originated, or where they have been carried on from the places where they were originally practiced before colonization, changed the landscape, the social landscape, and the human landscape there. So yeah, I mean, there's plenty of and the POC fungi community and Oakland Hyphae, and like a lot of these groups are like really engaging that conversation directly, and I think that's great. I think that there's hope that it could maybe take a different path than the one that the cynic might assume it's on, and it definitely is on. It's going in that direction, but one hopes that could change, again, because of the unique circumstances and the unique properties of fungi and the kinds of communities and conversations they're inspiring. So really, I'm hoping to maybe in my small way encourage that outcome, and not with so much of an emphasis on the psychedelic stuff, because again, that's not my ken so much. But like you said, it's been immensely helpful for a lot of people, and I think the therapeutic potential, and probably would want some degree of regularity and regulation, and have it plug into existing structures of healthcare and stuff, which also need to be completely revolutionized. So which do you focus on first? But that said, I also feel like, yeah, you're basically right. It's a form of colonization.
Before I get to a few last questions from some of my followers, I just want to talk real quick about In Search of Mycotopia, and my understanding of your thesis being like, let's pause on making these broad claims that mushrooms will save the world, be it through holistic healing or climate solutions. On the surface, and I have in parentheses, and under the surface, we have this fascinating, complex, ubiquitous kingdom of life that connects everything, that keeps the world ticking, and that we happen to know very little about. So how can we learn to sort of move away from this solutionist mindset of mushrooms will save the world and start laying down the groundwork for actual science?
Yeah, well said. I think that articulates my thesis probably better than I did in the book. Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know that I had a thesis until I was finishing it. I was like, oh, okay, I guess this is what I'm trying to say here. The basic idea is that instead of trying to think of them as a solution or as a savior, we think of them as cause to rethink, and as a cause to like maybe shift the way we relate to the planet, to, its natural systems, of which we're inevitably and inextricably part. And through that, I think inevitably it will have an effect on how we relate to one another, because the whole thing is one thing anyway, as we've been kind of alluding to. So I hope that that's sort of the thread of the conversation that doesn't get lost in all of the hype that is here and is going to get bigger around mushroom medicines and mycomaterials. And I would rather my house be built out of mushroom bricks than, drywall and, wood from who knows where. But, it's, I think I say in the book too, it's probably necessary, but definitely insufficient, so, all I can think to do, or in my position, all I can really do is to try to uplift the conversation that like I said before, reflects the values that I think need to be upheld. I think people in general might just try to yeah, stay tuned to like what they're receiving from mushrooms and from through, you know, what their curiosity of mushrooms may lead them to is maybe a curiosity about trees or a curiosity about ecologies or spending time in the forest. From that, I think you'll get the signals that point in the right direction, you know, more than you will from some Instagram account that's got, you know, really good branding for their little bottles of tinctures and um,
We're suckers for good
pills.
branding.
Yeah, yeah, you know, and mushrooms are just evocative and attractive, and they make great, you know, they're just eye-catching. And that's not to, again, I feel like I have to walk a line here. I mean, a lot of these people are my friends too, and you know, I know their motivations are good. And you know, we live in the society that we do, and we do what we have to do. In the meantime, or in the midst of that, I hope that we're listening to what nature is telling us, you know, and whether it's through mushrooms or something else. But um, yeah, in my experience, the people who are really listening are kind of picking up on the same signal, and I have to have faith that that's going to win out over the noise of marketing. That is,
Yeah,
you
very
know,
well said.
overblown.
Mushrooms do not have to be our heroes. They are already our messengers, right?
Yeah, yeah. We can only save ourselves. You know,
Right.
they'll be fine.
Do you mind if I fire off a couple final questions that I got from people on Instagram?
Oh, please, I'd love to.
All right. So Ella is wondering, are there any specific mushrooms I should be cooking with? And my amazing partner, Courtney, is wondering, what is your favorite mushroom to cook? How do you prepare it? I'm trying to make some fungi meals.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Anything that's not a button mushroom is probably a good kind of rubric to start with. I mean, they're fine on a pizza, whatever, but like you're missing out.
Right, but that's like the default mushroom, and it's like far from the best one, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't like them very much at all. And after having eaten, you know, I mean, even if you just start with like an oyster or a, you know, shiitake, I love shiitake. They're like one of my favorite mushrooms and they're kind of basic, you know, but I don't think so. I think they're amazing, but you know, everyone's heard of them. They're considered a specialty mushroom. So you got like that whole class, shiitake, maitake, or hen of the woods. You got king trumpets, oysters. But to answer Courtney's question directly, my favorite right now, at least, is chicken of the woods. It's just
I've
so
been dying
good.
to try some chicken of the woods.
It's my favorite. We found
How do
some.
you cook it? How do you prepare it?
I'm kind of I'm not too sophisticated with this stuff. I just saute it dry first, or I toss it on a dry pan because it's got a lot of moisture in it, and so I'm trying to reduce that. And then I add oil once it starts to sear. And yeah, you just treat it like chicken, basically. I mean, I toss in
Beautiful.
onions and maybe some salt and pepper, and it's just like chicken strips, you know. And it's bright orange. It's just got this. It just adds a color to any plate. Black Forager is a popular Instagram. They just did a video, I think like 2 days ago, where they found like 15 pounds of it, and they went through
Holy shit.
three different recipes for chicken of the woods for like soup, bacon, and steaks. Like kind of
Wow.
using a tuft of it to make three different things. So
I will check that out.
that was
I
with
think we might be stumbling into some big patriarch conspiracy to put button mushrooms on everything. I think that actually might be the source of where my mushroom disgust came from.
you eat them and you kind of feel like, should I like this? You know, that's how I feel with them. And
Yeah,
there's
like,
definitely
this is good.
I can tell you that there is definitely like an industrial, you know, there's a reason that you see so many of those things.
All
It's
right.
not, and part of it too is that specialty mushrooms are not as shelf stable, so they don't ship as well, you know. And so I kind of like that about them. They favor a
Right,
local, you know, economy, and so go
right.
figure. Um,
Sebastian is wondering, did mushrooms come from space?
I love this question because I see a lot of this angst over the question of, they call it panspermia, which is the notion that um, life was kind of seeded here by spores from outer space, which is fun to think about. I've never seen any evidence that that's actually the case. And when you think about it, I mean, we share DNA with them, you know, like we can trace our DNA, and we can trace progenitors to fungi and ancestors to fungi. So they're part of the same kind of tree of life, to use that faulty metaphor, which to me is actually a more profound thought. You know, I found it,
Right.
I find it way more profound to think that that we are related to them directly than to think that they
Yeah.
are, although I don't know, maybe they came down and they spawned life. But as far as the phylogenetic, you know, information that I've seen, they aren't the seed of life itself. So it's fun to think about, but I don't
Bummer.
think it's
It kind
proven.
of discredits Earth a little bit, right? Too. Yeah. Sorry,
Makes it more
Sebastian.
special, in my opinion. Yeah, to think that like,
Yeah.
yeah, we
Yeah.
really are
Fun
all
to
just
think
kind of,
about, but they probably didn't come from space, is going to be the conclusion.
yeah.
Filipos is wondering, why do mycelium networks allow trees to connect and communicate with their saplings?
I mean, I don't think it was like a decision, you know, that was made at any point. I think it was probably just the result of coevolution, a symbiosis, the basis of symbiosis. And I think that that's, you know, I think it's probably just speaks more broadly to like the fact that evolution is not as competitive as it's often framed. It's, I mean, natural selection, you know, you're talking about like what survives and what dies. Okay, that makes enough sense. But like what survives is often doing so because of mutually beneficial, you know, dynamics. It may come at the expense of something else. Those
Right.
relationships have been around for so long and they're so refined and deep. And it's, yeah, the matter of time. Once it's established, if it survives, I think it just gets richer and richer. And that's where you see like, yeah, underground energy economies and, you know, connections, the wood wide web.
Great. Thank you. And lastly, Mary is wondering, are there any mushroom myths that you'd like to debunk?
Mushroom myths. Well, actually, you touched on one earlier, pun intended, which is the notion that you can, you know, that there's any risk posed by touching a mushroom. As you know, I don't want to be the first person to be responsible for proving this wrong or something, you know, or like someone who listened to me say this, find out like, oh, the deadly touch mushroom. But you know, even something like the destroying angel or, you know, like Amanita phalloides, like the deadly stuff, it's deadly if you eat it. And
Right.
so, you know, huge
Really
asterisk here.
ominous names, though.
Well named, yeah. I mean, they kind of look like it too. Once you see, if you've seen them in the woods, they carry a sort of menacing air. Every mushroom is safe to touch.
Amazing. Thank you for debunking that myth. That
Oh,
is
sure.
all I have for you today. I'm gonna real quick plug your book.
Oh,
I
there it
have
is.
it. Can you plug it real quick?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, well, there it is. In Search of
Here it is.
Mycotopia. I'm really happy with the cover that they came up with
It's a
for it.
beautiful cover, and the way that it glows under a black light,
Yeah, it was a nice touch.
stunning.
I wish
Yeah.
I could claim
In
credit for
Search of
that.
Mycotopia, Citizen Science, Fungi Fanatics, and the Untapped Potential of Mushrooms. It's a beautiful title, too.
Yeah, thanks. My
Thank you
first
for
idea
writing
was
it.
to call it
And
Among Us, which I thought would have been really,
that's
yeah.
good. And then the video game came out and just ruined that fun.
Yeah, yeah, it might have been competition.
All right, cool. Thank you so much, Doug. I really appreciate your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.